Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you briefly about utilizing your primary sources effectively when analyzing them for historical research. And I'm calling this Yeah, but Can I Trust It? We encounter primary sources on a daily basis. Every time you open up your Snapchat app or Facebook or Instagram and you look at the items that are being produced by people, you are looking at primary sources. And hopefully, always you ask yourself, can I trust what I'm seeing? I think first we need to step back a bit and define primary sources, particularly when we're talking about historical study. According to the Library of Congress, these are the raw materials of history. This includes a wide variety of documents and objects, everything from photographs to letters to diaries, newspaper articles, speeches, even actual items like our cell phones or cotton gins. All sorts of things can be primary sources when we're talking about historical study. The big question, though, is, are these sources reliable? I think usually when students or scholars hear primary sources in a history class, they immediately think, yes, these things are reliable, they're trustworthy, I can believe the person who is speaking to me through this piece of paper or through this computer screen, as the case may be. But I think we need to complicate that a little bit because just like today, people in the past created media. They were writing about the things they saw, the things they experienced, things they thought were important. Those are the things they're taking photographs of. Art is not always reliable. One of the purposes of artists is to have us question our reality or see things in a different perspective. That's true sometimes of created media as well, things like documents or speeches. Primary documents can reliably tell us someone's perceptions of an event. But unfortunately, they can't independently confirm the accuracy of that interpretation. So for example, this week you guys are looking at the Confessions of Nat Turner as recorded by Thomas R. Gray. So that man is a lawyer, right, and presumably he is interviewing Nat Turner after the rebellion to sort of collect his recollections and confessions of the event. On face value, this is completely accurate and something that we could use as, without a shadow of a doubt, accurate information. But of course, we have to acknowledge bias exists. There is a reason Thomas Gray was talking to Nat Turner, and it wasn't necessarily just to inform people or prepare something for the newspaper readership who are interested in the rebel slaves' testimony. We have to look a little deeper than that. Can't take things at face value. So here are a few questions to consider anytime you look at primary sources, just to help you evaluate how to use them or how best to use them, especially if you are preparing to write a paper or something similar. So things to investigate. Who wrote this document? Is this person a slave owner? Are they a freed slave? If they are a lawyer, in the case of Thomas R. Gray, is he Nat Turner's lawyer? Is he a lawyer for the prosecution? Do we know, and can we find out? Asking those questions might make a really intense difference in how we look at this source. And if we know that, let's say Thomas Gray is not, in fact, Nat Turner's lawyer, but working for the prosecution, his interpretation of Turner's confession and his point of view might be very different and much less sympathetic than if he were Turner's lawyer himself. When did this person write the document? Did they write it immediately after they had the event? Did they write it 2 years after the event? Or did they write it maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years after the event as a memoir or a recollection? These sort of questions can really impact someone's interpretation of something. Like your immediate response to a major event or a discussion with someone can be a lot different than after you've had time to think about it and consider the events and what the person actually said. You could argue that something written immediately after is perhaps more accurate in the moment, and then something that's written a few years later or even a few days later is perhaps more true to the person's interpretation of the event. Once you've had time to think about it, your understanding of something might change a bit. An additional concern is where something is written, when it is produced, because people often write for an audience, so the where ties in really well with the next question of, was this published or intended for publication? Thomas Gray was preparing a statement for publication in Southampton, Virginia. His intended audience would be the white literate slave owners who are very interested in knowing about Turner's rebellion, perhaps even how they could prevent something similar happening in their own community. So his purpose in writing there is going to be a little bit different, and maybe some of his wording will be a little bit different based upon the intended audience. So let's take it to a teenage example. If you're preparing a Facebook post that you know only your friends are going to see, you may word it a little bit differently than if you know your parents or church members or potential employers are going to see it. So your intended audience has a really strong impact on the content and the style of what is being written. So it is a necessary and important question to ask when you're looking at a primary document. And the final question you should really consider is, does this person have an agenda in writing what they are writing? Do they have an axe to grind? Does this person have some stake in the argument? And if they do have a stake in the issue, do they acknowledge that that stake exists? And do they provide some evidence that they can actually discuss the topic without purely just selling their own idea and their own perspective? These are some really important questions to consider when you're thinking about the trustworthiness of a source. Just because a source is of questionable trustworthiness, it doesn't necessarily mean that the producer is intentionally lying. It doesn't mean that the source is useless for historical research purposes. It just means you have to treat it carefully and make sure that you confirm the evidence or the perspective that's presented in it with multiple other sources, just to give a more clear picture of what you're studying. I hope these questions and this really brief review helps you out as you're moving forward and dealing with primary sources. Bye.